and welcome to today's A-Team Group webinar on managing data governance for ESG. My name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at A-Team Group, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Paul Jones, Director, Data Analytics and AI Practice at Baringa Partners, Hani Choueiri, Board Member, Sustainability and Vice Chair at the Global LEI Foundation, and Philip Miller, Co-CEO at Solidatus. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a minute, but first a few bits that you might find useful as we go through the webinar. To the right of your video screen, you'll see a Slido section. It's got two parts. One is for poll questions, and we'll be asking 3 of those during the webinar, so please do pick your answers and let us know what you're thinking. And then there's a section for questions, and I will take those questions as we go along. Some noise is going on, I'll turn that off. A question for an area for questions. So please do ask your questions as we go along so that we can ask those indeed as we go along. If we leave them to the end, we won't get to them. So just put your questions in when you like, and I'll ask them when I can, which is great. So enjoy the webinar, and let me come back to our speakers and ask Paul, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Sarah. So my name is Paul Jones. As Sarah mentioned, I'm a director in Baringa's Data Analytics and AI practice. I've been working in the data management space for coming on to 18 years, in both consulting and industry roles, including I was the global head of data governance for Barclays, where I set up their first group-wide data governance structures. I was a data protection officer and head of data governance for Nationwide Building Society. And I joined Baringa back in November last year. Been working mainly in the financial services sector, and Baringa does a lot in the ESG space. So we have a team that's dedicated to that space, and I've been working quite closely with them on a number of projects related to ESG. So looking forward to participating today. Excellent,
thank you. Hani, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Nice to be here again. I'm Hani Choueiri, Vice Chair of the GLIFE, also looking at ESG in all its forms and with keen interest in the last couple of years. As well as having been Chief Data Officer at quite a number of organizations, consulting, advising, most recently also advising on ESG, which is, again, from a data perspective, quite a big challenge for everyone. So really looking forward to today and participating and listening to the poll questions and trying to share our thoughts.
Excellent, thank you. And over to you, Philip. You've got your mute on.
Of course I am, yes. To echo what Hani said, it's really good to be here today. So I'm Philip Miller, co-founder at Solidatus. I've spent my entire life, I guess, running around with data and trying to make it useful for people. Solidatus is in and of itself is a response to really complicated data problems, and a lot of them are around regulation and being able to present data properly and clearly and transparently. So I guess that's where I dedicate my life now is in that transparent use of data and against its purpose and context. And ESG, I guess, is something that I've latched onto more recently for all the right reasons. I think it's very important for all of us to get this one right. If it's to show how investment can be done properly and sustainably, then we've got to do it transparently.
Okay, let's talk about it. Thank you very much indeed. But first, let's get started with an audience poll. The question: how much progress has your organization made on sustainable investment? And while you answer the question, let me come back to you, Philip, if I may, to set the scene and tell us how you see the state of play on sustainable investment.
So I guess it starts off with, the tiniest of retrospectives. It's something that everyone said they did on paper. We sustainable investment is something, if you invest in me, then you're doing it in the right way. I think the best thing to say about sustainable investment is that you're investing in progress. You're looking at a company and saying, if I invest in you, you're going to do the right thing sustainably. So looking at the whole of ESG, so whatever metrics are coming out are going to demonstrate progress. And looking at it from a data point of view, I want to be able to, as a company, prove to my investors and probably my stakeholders in every way, shape or form that I am going to make progress. So even if I get it right, if I can't demonstrate that I'm getting it right, that's not going to help me. So really the focus will be much more on well, there'll be the carrot and the stick. If you get it right, you'll be able to show a good return. And I imagine that the ESG and sustainable investment is doing quite well. It's quite resilient at the moment against other types of investments. So the state of play is you're investing in progress, and you need to demonstrate to those who have invested in you that you are making progress, and that's a continuous thing.
Okay, Paul, how do you see things out there?
So I'd say clearly sustainable investment has accelerated significantly in recent years, both in terms of interest in it and relevance. And I think that we've really reached a tipping point, actually, in terms of recognition of just how important it is. So organizations recognizing how important it is, an increasing recognition that this is going to be getting bigger and bigger in the future. So it's big, and it's getting bigger all the time. But the other thing I'd say is that with all of the emerging regulations, everything is still in flux. So things are still being defined, things are still evolving, and things are going to continue to change for some time. So, I mean, it's fantastic that it has the kind of profile that it has now. And I think, it's a really positive thing for the world. It's clearly a really good thing. But there's a lot of change coming. And so that's clearly something that needs to be factored in terms of everything that organizations and investors need to take into consideration as they respond to that.
Excellent. Thank you, Henny. How do you see sustainable investment going at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Philip said is true. I suppose, it's everyone's trying to invest or put their money that when they have a choice into a sustainable product service, right? But I think, more globally, I suppose what I'm seeing is it depends which side of the world you're sitting on, to some extent. I think on the US side, I'm not seeing a tremendous impact, as it were, from a systematic sort of sustainable investment. And that's simply because of the approach, I suppose, that's being taken from a regulatory perspective. I mean, we've seen the SEC try to even just put in climate risk considerations, not even pushing for climate improvement, but simply just telling organizations, please report your climate risks so investors understand your climate risk. And there was a backlash even just to do that. Right? So it's quite some way behind, I suppose. Asia, I suppose it's mediocre. I think but it's evolving because it's really driven, I suppose, what I'm seeing is driven from the pressure from consumers, as many Asian countries tend to be suppliers of products and services. So that there's sort of an element of, well, I'll only buy products and services from you if you demonstrate that they're being done more and more sustainably, be it from a people perspective, anti-slavery, et cetera, to more sustainable, crops growing, coffee beans, et cetera, to the more, hard kind of consumer products like washing machines and fridges and what have you. So I suppose that's going to happen by default because we're going to be selective on which suppliers we use. And in some way, you can think of that as sustainable investment, right? Europe, of course, is at the forefront. And Sarah, you write about this quite a bit. Very much driven, hardline at the forefront, driven by very specific EU taxonomy, which is trying to basically make sure organizations actually comply with what is sustainable and what is not. I know there's recently some changes to that, which are quite interesting, around energy and what have you in Europe. But really, that's going to be very, very specific. And actually to the extent where, when you go and you invest in your pension, and if you have a choice, you'll be told, do you want to invest in a sustainable fund or not? And who wouldn't say no? Right? Nobody would say no. I asked a question at another conference, and there's a tolerance, right? If you getting 5% return, non-sustainable, you're probably happy to live with 4.5%, maybe not 3 or 2, but the margins are thinning, and there's some tolerance where people are prepared to invest sustainably. Okay. So that's basically it. So, but I think the final thing to say, Sarah, on that is, I suppose that the challenge is the best value for your dollar, euro, pound is when you invest in organizations who are actually not sustainable, but who are using those funds to become sustainable. So that's another dilemma we have is invest in already sustainable organizations, actually, you're not making a massive difference. So I think there's another lens to this, which is frequently overlooked, I think, and that's something maybe we can discuss later as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for setting us up, everybody. And can we see the poll results, please? Okay, Paul, does that ring any bells with you? Does that look about right, or are people further along than you might expect?
I think that's kind of what I was expecting. I mean, it's good to see that so many people are making progress, but clearly there is. I mean, every organisation that I'm aware of and have been talking to would recognise that there is much more to do. So even those that have made good progress, and again, part of that is because of the change, because of the fact that there's so much coming. There's going to be more to do, even if you've made really good progress to this date. So,
okay,
really interesting results, though.
Good to see. Thank you very much indeed. And Hani, coming back to you, we've talked about ESG. It's a very wide topic. What approaches do you suggest we can take to sort of break it down, or it is the E and the S and the G? How can people best approach it?
Yeah, clearly, there are these three buckets, right, of E, S, and G. And I think, there's various definitions, but largely, I think they're quite standardized now in terms of, environment, governance, etc., and society. I suppose the challenge that organizations have in terms of breaking it down is sometimes you've got the kind of clearly the ESG, but then you've got the other dimension, which is, there's an ESG from the perspective of every organization wanting to become more ESG friendly and report on ESG, report on diversity, on climate consumption, and what have you. So there is this need to pull a lot of data together in whatever format to publish to the world your sustainability policy and how well you're doing on various measures, depending on how you take it. There's then, of course, these are things that you choose to do. Then there's things you must do, regulatory compliance. And so there is this piece around, well, you must report the following report at year end, your pay gap, gender pay gap, et cetera, or climate figures. So there's, again, regulatory compliance. Then there's an interesting one there is supplier perspective to this. So as a supplier, virtually many organizations now, when they buy a product or a service, they're asking that sustainability question. So as a supplier, you're going to be able to answer and demonstrate that you are sustainable, because otherwise I really don't want to be dealing with you if you're not sustainable. More broadly, there's no regulation, but there's that public pressure, I suppose, societal pressure, investor pressure, shareholder pressure. Then there's the investor and there's an investee, right? So as an investor, when you invest, in pension funds, etc., then how does that work? What are the measures you're going to look at? And on the receiving end, as an investee, what you have to demonstrate. And again, there's sometimes regulation, sometimes there isn't. But there's different lenses, and I think some people just think ESG is just one thing. But actually, when you try to get organized internally, you find it breaks down into a number of sort of semi-disciplines, and you've got to figure out how to best organize them.
Okay, Philip, what would you add to that? How do you see financial firms breaking it down and trying to address it?
Well, so I agree with what Hani was saying there. I think the breaking down is very critical, and I think in terms of supply chain. So I have a supply chain, and I'm in someone else's supply chain, and we all affect each other. I mean, this is the environment thing. We're all part of the environment together. If I do badly at my own sort of recognition of my own credentials, let's say, I am going to be doing badly by the people I supply, and so we live in this connected world. The other thing to consider, I think, is that it's a global context, and the different parts of the globe are considering these things in different ways. So one person's good may not necessarily be another person's excellent as well. And so we need to be able to be clear about how we are classifying things for ourselves so that it is utterly consistent. We might find that investing from one market doesn't equate to a good investment from another market. And I've used this example before, probably with you, Sarah, or at least with Andrew. Tesla today, as an example, electric cars, all great, but there's a lot of lithium in their production. So today it might look like a really good investment. Tomorrow lithium mining might be a very bad thing to do. So we but in the global context, one person might consider that good, one person might consider that bad. So I think the approach must be to expect everything at the moment in terms of how you break things down, and to be clear about how you're classifying stuff, so that you can respond transparently to the requests and the requirements of particularly the regulations, which at the moment are the main drivers, although they're moving now into shareholder value, and societal value will come out at the end of it. So the classification for me, and understanding yourself, is the critical way of breaking it down, because of the supply chain. You are both a supplier and the supplied to.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. Okay, and coming back to you, Paul, what would you say about the volumes and varieties of ESG data that need to be managed to ensure customer satisfaction and regulatory compliance? And I think the answer is more than a lot.
I think a lot would be a good summary. And Hanny and Philip's overview there of just the breadth of what ESG actually covers is a good starting point, because immediately that means there's going to be a wide variety of data that's required. And if you just talk through the different consumers of that data, of course, you have investors who need data to be able to make decisions on what they're going to be investing in. You have regulators and governments and those kinds of organizations who want to set targets and want to be able to track how organizations are doing. Then you have the organizations themselves who want to be able to assess where they are and make decisions about how they're making internal investments and making moving things forward. And then you can then, even at the most simple level, before you get into ESG taxonomies, you've got the three pillars of environmental, social, and governance. In the environmental space, you've got all the climate change information, emissions, energy usage, water usage, recycling, and there's a whole load of things there. And again, the kinds of dimensions that organizations are looking at are continuing to evolve in that space. In the social space, you've got both internal and external. So you've got all of the kind of diversity metrics and pay ratio and health and safety, and also what's happening in terms of charitable work and all those kinds of things. And then in the governance space, you've got all of the, again, some overlap in terms of things like board diversity, but then you're looking at ethics and conduct. That's where the actual ESG reporting requirements often come in from the regulator. And then you take all of that. So immediately the variety means you automatically have a large volume, because if you're collecting data across all these different data points, and then when you look at the type of data you're looking at, quite often you're looking at financial transactions, and you've got to be able to tag all those transactions by all these kinds of things. Then you've got to run models across them to be able to do forecasting, and that generates more data, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think a lot would be a good summary. Going back to what you said before, there is very high level of variety and volume.
It's bigger than big data, Paul, isn't it? It's bigger than big data.
Bigger than big data.
Massive data, that's right.
Okay, fine. Philip, what would you say when you're out there also in the market, you're seeing these volumes of data, and what are you seeing, and are people coping?
So I think Hanny said it at the beginning of the previous answer. I think these two questions are quite related, as Paul said. You kind of you're seeing a lot of change in what people are expecting over time. So if I take other regulatory reporting kind of evolutions, you kind of have the spirit of what you want to do at the beginning, right? So we're just I think in some ways we're just moving out of the spirit of the idea. We're moving out of that phase now. We want to do the ESG things, and Paul's done a very good job of breaking down what the E and the S and the G mean. But actually, we need to be clear that we will require data that we don't know that we need today. And we have to have spots for that. And I think the big lesson I've learned over the last, I guess, 15 years now is if we don't leave the capacity to evolve our reporting into the frameworks that we build, we can't just wholesale keep shifting from one framework to another, or from one taxonomy to another. We have to leave evolvability at the center of what we're doing. So understanding what we've got, understanding why two very, very similar sounding terms might be actually different from each other, or leaving the ability to create space in a report for a new data point without having to break the entire reporting system from front to back. that's not very sustainable just as a mechanism of doing the reporting. You might find that you absolutely have to make changes for global context. And I'm going to probably bat on about global context a bit, because living in the global world, if you're in the South Pacific versus the middle of Europe, you've got different environmental concerns. For example, I mean, rising sea levels for the South Pacific probably trumps most social stuff, to be perfectly honest. If you're just interested in the environment, so you're going to find that those concerns create a very diverse set of reporting. So that's the a lot that both you and Sarah and Paul were talking about. But the context of which it comes out of the report and the context of which it might change, if you don't leave space for variety of reporting for the markets that you're operating in, and therefore the regulators and the consumers, shareholders or otherwise, of this data, you're going to find yourself with a very expensive problem, one which of course affects your share price at one fundamental level, because it'll affect how people can buy from you or how people will invest in you, and that could be really detrimental. And of course the other thing is that if you are finding yourself in a position where you're reporting incorrectly, or you're reporting at the wrong level of quality, which I think Hani was just saying, quality of this data is going to evolve as well. You have to be able to fix this stuff and probably retro-fix it to be demonstrably transparent. So you have to give yourself flexibility at all points to recognize that things will change.
Stuff, because we're not exactly sure how they'll change. But okay, let's carry on, and let's run another audience poll question with all that data. The question is, what are the challenges of managing ESG data at your organization? And this time you can tick as many of the boxes as are appropriate to your organization. And while you do that, let me come back to Philip to talk a little bit about the challenges of dealing with ESG data.
It's the big data problem. You've got the management of that data, particularly when you can't classify it at the beginning. You've got to be able to source data, and this doesn't just live in an ESG world. And actually, particularly with the S stuff, it's going to be quite nebulous. You may not even know that you need to source. Again, you may not know that you need to source a piece of data, and it might become important for you very quickly. So the challenges with dealing with data is probably instrumentation of your organization. So being able to get the right agency through the organization to get into that mindset of acknowledging when it's doing something and reporting it in a clear, transparent way. So a lot of times you'll find that organizations are doing quite a lot of environmental stuff. The example that I got, I think, from someone from the Cabinet Office was talking at an event I went to a couple of months ago, and they said, well, I went to a factory, and that factory said, well, we're a heavy industry, blah, 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 we haven't done much. And he just looked up and he said, oh, look, but you've got LED lighting. And he said, but that's a really good example of becoming more efficient. And the guy went, oh, gosh, yeah, we have. We've replaced all the lights with LEDs. And he said, well, that's brilliant. You're lowering your electricity footprint and everything else. And he said, look, just keep finding things like that you can do over time. And the guy went, but the facilities guys just replaced that stuff. Okay, so facilities are now involved with ESG reporting, right? You've got to make sure everybody understands that they have a part to play. So if you're doing something like moving, biodegradable from plastic to biodegradable stuff, maybe that's something that people recognize. But if you're doing that with, cleaning cloths, maybe the cleaners don't realize that they can be reporting that through, and that actually means something. So the challenge is to make sure you're in a place you can instrument your entire organization and store the data in a way that you can get to it, that you recognize its value, even if you don't recognize it immediately, but you will recognize it.
Okay, wow. Hani, where do you see the challenges of dealing with all this data?
Yeah, I think Philip summarized it quite nicely. I think one of the challenges, I suppose, is, in addition to that, is you've got this unstructured data to deal with as well. Mm. So if we look at the World Economic Forum model, first thing is purpose and mission statements, etc. So that's by its nature, it's unstructured, right? You're going to get a piece of blurb, piece of text that the organization has published out to the world, talking about their sustainability mission, and so that's fine. So I suppose you can classify it as an unstructured, and you're storing it, and you're publishing it. Now imagine at the receiving end, you're going to take that and you're going to interpret it, or you're going to rank it in some way, right? Because if you have to select between this sustainability, this company and some other company, you got to say, well, which one kind of is better? And it's quite hard to tell, isn't it? Get two companies and no sustainability report looks bad, right? Don't think I've ever seen a sustainability report that reads badly. So there's that challenge. And then that challenge of that data continuously morphing, and how do you capture all these great things that you've done in a structured way? We've done LED lighting, we've saved X per year, etc. We've done something else that saved another energy amount Y in the following 3 years, right? And you've got to figure out how you store that information to be able to publish it out. I suppose that all that practice, that BCBS 239, I don't want to say horrible regulation, but that data regulation on BCBS 239 said the lineage, where data comes from, the metadata, the glossaries, the quality, all of that stuff still applies. And this is really important data. It's not data that is just there because it impacts your share price, it impacts your credibility, it impacts your reputation, and we've seen a lot of issues already in reputationally where people have said their wrong thing, behaved their own way, and all it takes is a couple of bad numbers that actually aren't true for accidentally or whatever to really damage the reputation of an organization, and you've got to go back and trace it. And then overlay that with large complex organizations that are always acquiring firms, and you have the LEI where I don't know actually who's doing the reporting, and now all right, now you've acquired 5 more companies, so I can see why your numbers have changed, right? But which entity is doing the reporting at what level? All that aggregation itself is also very complex.
I like that example, Hani, because that's a really good one where you've got 2 companies that maybe consider a particular piece of data in a different way, and you push them together, and actually, if you look at the organizations, one organization may have reported something, the organization that's purchased it or merged with it may have thought that figure meant something else, and then you pull it into your organization, and suddenly you're like, that's not the thing that I thought it was. And oh gosh, do I then retrofit that stuff? Can I go back in time? Can I look at how it was arrived at? Can I then wave my hands a little bit? Was my investment decision wrong? All of this stuff is going to start to happen. It's not just, was the company profitable? It's like, they thought that was something else. Oops.
That's hard. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's see what our audience thinks in terms of the challenges they're facing. And Philip, do you want to comment on this one, please?
Well, I'm a standards person.
Okay.
Yeah, so we've got to get to standards quicker than we want to, perhaps, because this is the classic one where where we're going to be spinning our wheels, spending lots and lots of money, and then rewriting. It's good to get to an internal standard, I think, and then use that as a decoupler for, in the interim. Decide what your own figures mean, and then be very clear about what they are. Have a good data dictionary on that sort of stuff, or a glossary on that sort of stuff. The unstructured stuff, of course, Hani opened with that, and unstructured data is huge in this area. We're going to have to get better at dealing with it, and better at making sure we have a harmonious assessment of what my version of something means versus what your version of something means, the merger problem, or just the comparing apples with apples. So I'm not surprised with it. Huge volumes of data, I think people are underestimating. I think, depending on, I guess, who the audience is, the data volumes of any of this stuff are absolutely colossal. So yeah, not surprised.
Thank you. That's great. Okay, so coming back to you, Paul, if I may, looking at all these challenges and the amount of data and the differences in data and understanding and so on, how can data management and data governance be implemented to better understand ESG data, make strategies and achieve compliance?
Good question. I mean, and just starting with data governance, the whole point of data governance is to get a handle on your data. So it's to understand, starting with the why. So what is the need, but then saying, well, where is that data, and what is the definition of the data, and what's its quality, and how do we improve it on that basis? So the whole concept of data governance is about understanding the data so that you can then get more value out of it, make sure that you meet regulatory requirements and so on and so forth. And So I would say that if you do it in the right way, and the example that Hanny and Philip were just discussing there, where you take a piece of data and you think it's one thing and it turns out it's something else, that's a classic issue, which if you have good standards in place, clear definitions, and you can see that it may have the same label, but you know that they're two different things because you've got the appropriate governance and metadata around it to be able to identify that and resolve those kinds of issues. And then the data management piece that goes alongside that is all of the technology and processes that you need to put in place to make this work. And I think the big opportunity in this space, especially because we're talking about the large volumes and varieties of data, is there's no way you can deal with that volume without implementing technology to deal with it. And so if you look at this with a kind of take a fresh perspective on it and say, maybe this is an opportunity to start getting some of this stuff. If you have all the legacy issues that came up in the poll, for example, what steps can you take to start automating some of this stuff? Automating all of the metadata around it and the compliance reporting and those kinds of things, so that you're not dependent on the old way of, going around with a clipboard style of data governance, which just isn't scalable. I mean, it works for certain things, but it's just not scalable. So I think I would say data governance, absolutely, you implement it properly and you will gain a better understanding of your ESG data, and it will support your ESG strategy and compliance, because ultimately all of this, everything that you need to do in this space runs on data. So it's pretty crucial that you get that right.
Okay, favorite topic, Philip, what would you say here?
I'm going to go back to my instrumentation point, and I think that segues very nicely with what Paul was saying. The clipboard going around the organization, looking up and seeing have you got a window open, or the equivalent thereof. It's fine for a one-off report, and actually force majeure for something urgent, getting people to put their names to things is fine. There comes a point when you just have to recognize that an organization has to taking a leaf out the DevOps book, shift left and automate. You have to recognize that you're not going to be very mature if you're doing something very, very, very sporadically, which is what a person going around with a clipboard is. I mean, they're going to be only as good as their own record keeping. So as good as the questions on their own clipboard, you're not going to be able to ask new questions easily. If you decide an extra question needs to be asked, you're going to have trouble rolling that out across the organization. I've written two words down, I guess, when thinking about this particular question. It's federate and empower. You need to tell people this is what you need to do. You need to say to them, it's your job to do it. That's part of your scorecard for the year. You need to let them get on with it. And you need to be able to trust what they give you. And for a large organization, you're not going to have any other way of doing that. But if you haven't got the central pieces in place, the data management, the data governance frameworks, you're going to be in big trouble, because you'll have nowhere to collect this stuff, nowhere to store it, nowhere to analyze it. And that'll be a big problem with you. But for you, when compliance comes along and says, actually, you're not doing it in the right way, you've got to go out and ask again. The automation stuff can't overstress. If you can get that right, you will be able to change direction if that's needed. I think that's really the key, is empowerment through automation.
Okay, so Hanny, coming over to you with the importance of governance, automation in place. There are always challenges. What are the challenges of getting to these kinds of places, and how do you integrate ESG governance with enterprise data governance?
Yeah, I think these are quite complementary, because if one thing we've seen during my data career, anyways, is we've seen improvements, right, in a whole host of data governance policies. And regardless of what anybody says, we have matured. All industries have matured to a large extent at different rates. But I think it's now recognizing ESG data isn't just something you do in a spreadsheet, right? Recognizing that also needs that same data treatment. It needs to be treated like your financial reports because of its importance, right? And what can go wrong with it. So I think in many ways, you kind of leveraging the existing policy standards, ownership, data quality, the dictionaries, the glossaries, but potentially also thinking about, the variety, and Paul talked about that, such a massive variety of sources where this stuff comes from. And sometimes you may want to extract it all. Extracting it can be quite onerous to get it all into one place, but at least even if you don't extract it, knowing where it's come from, virtualizing it, or using such good technologies, to tag the metadata without physically moving, gigabytes around the organization to try and get it all into one place. That's what kind of data fabric. I know there was a session last week on that from the A team. It was a good session on technology and data mesh and data fabrics. So there's a lot of technology. I think one has to look at that, understand the context of the data, the frequency of the data, and what metadata is required, and determine your strategy. And it doesn't necessarily mean bringing it all into one place, but it means having purview of it, making sure it's all auditable, the lineage, and then you can better manage it in case you've got to report it again or amend the numbers, or at some point people are going to be audited on this stuff as well. So you've got to demonstrate to the auditor saying, this is where I got this piece of information from, the source, and that's a golden source. So you don't necessarily have to bring it all together, because it's sometimes impossible. So you got to leverage all the technology available, I think, to make it happen in the best possible way for your organization.
Okay. Paul, from a practitioner's point of view, where are the challenges for you?
So I think if we're talking about ESG data particularly, actually Hanny mentioned it right near the beginning of this session. One of the key things that I've been seeing is where data just doesn't exist yet. So one of the key challenges, especially with small organizations that have never had to report on some of these dimensions, the data doesn't exist. So this is a much broader challenge for the industry, I guess, or the whole concept of how do we start driving consistent ESG practices and ESG reporting globally. That's a challenge, and that both is a challenge in terms of obtaining the data, but then of course a lot of these things are new. It's new data, so how do you then bring it into your own environment to integrate it with the other data sets you already have? And then going back to the point around changing requirements, the increasing variety and volume of these things, the changes in the regulations that are coming, the taxonomies that we're going to have to report by. If you're a global organization, you're probably going to have to report across more than one standard for different regulators and that kind of thing. And a lot of these things aren't, they're challenges that global organizations have always faced, but this is different data sets. It's cuts across a lot of things that organizations may or may not already report on. So, in a classic large banking organization, there's already a load of reporting around conduct risk, for example, which kind of aligns to some of the governance type things. And there's already various reporting across other risk areas, which including various things on how the organization's performing. But then there's a whole lot of extra things, and then you've got to integrate all of those things. So historically, these things would have been reported on separately in different areas. How do you create a joined up view? What does that mean in terms of the models that you need to develop and report on? That's where it starts becoming really difficult. It's not, in many cases, it's not the fact that, so either the data doesn't exist or it exists, but it's all over the place in different places. And you've got to find a way of bringing all of that together. And just going on to the integrating with the enterprise data governance point, I think it's crucial that this integrates with enterprise data governance because of the fact that it cuts across the entire organization and cuts across so many different areas. The only way that you're going to be able to start bringing these things together is by joining all of these activities up. That doesn't necessarily mean centralizing everything, but it definitely means coordinating everything. So you're going to need some place, and you don't necessarily have to call it central, but somewhere that does the coordination to make sure that you can start joining the dots on all of these things and start working out how you overcome some of these challenges in a way that is cost effective, because it'd be very easy for this to just explode in terms of costs, in terms of trying to solve this.
Right. Okay, thank you all. Let's take a few audience questions. We have quite a few here, and let's start here. Philip, one for you on standards. Well, quite a few on standards, so I'm going to pull them all together. Here we go. Are you ready? Is there a standard set of ESG metrics to track and report? Some of the metrics are confusing and difficult to understand. Perhaps the temperature score 3C to 1.5 C. What is your advice on how to report? Another one. Do we need standards for ESG from organizations such as ISO at the global level? Your thoughts? I know there aren't very many.
Well,
People are confused. What would you advise?
so half the problem with standards is keeping to them. The thing is that because things are in flux, and I've had this before. I've gone through standards shifting, implementation dates not moving a number of times over the last 15 years, and I'm sure Paul can, as a practitioner, feel the pain on this particular one. Look, in terms of getting an ISO standard together, so I sit on ISO. That is the right question. In the end, ISO will probably opine on this, but with ISO, it'll probably take 10 years. And that's not being glib. They're gonna try and get it right. But they can't just create a standard when the sands are shifting, daily. It would be ridiculous for them to come out with a global standard before we've actually settled on what we mean by anything. The truth is you probably need to take a look at your own organization and find the standard that best fits what you're doing, that has a certain amount of flexibility in it. And I'm not going to try and second guess who's on the call and pick a standard out. The European standards are okay. The UN have got some standards as well. That's fine. World Trade Organization stuff. You need to find something that's good enough for you, and then extend it in a nice enough way that you can be consistent. As add the bits in that make it fit for you, and then settle on that as a standard internal to yourself, and then use that as a hop off onto other standards or other frameworks that you need to implement in the short term, and recognize that in 5 or 10 years time, people are going to settle on something and it's going to be a lot more clear cut. What you can't do is delay collecting and weaponizing your organization for the collection of the data. That would be the error. You can't just say, oh, because it's so nebulous, I can't start. That's just not the right way. But I wouldn't try and hop from one standard to another as the fashions take. I'd just settle on something for 4 or 5 years, unless there's something massive that changes, and let that be an organizational standard, and one that you can evolve and translate into whatever global regulatory standards you need. Of course, if you're in a single market and it's very clear cut, use that. But if you're in a global context, I just don't think, I'm happy for someone else to jump in, but I just don't think it's worth worrying too much about trying to continuously be on the cutting edge. You just need something that works for you, that's got everything in it for you.
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd add, Philip, is I suppose the World Economic Forum's stakeholder capitalism model is probably the best I've seen, and certainly the organization I've recently advised have taken that approach now.
Yeah.
And the beauty of that is what they did well is they didn't try to recreate standards, but they point to anything existing. So, for example, for climate, they point to TCFD. TCFD is well-defined, reasonably well-defined, scope 1, 2, and 3, because it's kind of had been the number one priority, right? I think the other ones, GRI, actually, I'm quite impressed with the work they do. And you'll find specific GRI standards, the Global Reporting Initiative, that basically point to specific points. So the model will say, look at GRI 101-2.2, whatever the code may be. But there's certainly quite prescriptive standards emerging. And certainly organizations that have recently advised have taken that approach to go down that route, because it's the best.
Yeah, I agree with you.
It's going to change. It's going to change.
I agree with you. And I just think you've got to pick something and stick with it. Absolutely. Rather than to try and hop and hop and hop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lovely.
And I think just a final point. So I agree with all of the points made. I think the other thing is, just as with, if you're working in a big global organization, like a global bank, you probably already have compliance teams whose entire job is to map all the various regulations and maintain a view of, all of the different requirements and what's coming, and, horizon scanning, all those kinds of things. And the reality is that there are multiple requirements, and it is going to continuously change. So I think that it's just important that, given that many organizations are still early in this journey, designing your framework and your way of doing this to be able to evolve over time and to accommodate those things. But I think to Philip's point, ultimately you want to get to a place where you have a reporting capability where you can slice and dice it in different ways and you can satisfy different requirements, as well as having a view of, well, what are the various requirements that we're trying to meet? Because if you just go from the requirements back and say, right, I'm only going to deal with certain metrics, not worrying about the base data in such a way that you can then slice and dice it in different ways, you're going to end up with a new requirement coming in and going, oh no, that's a new thing, we've got to bring it in. But vice versa, I think that just to kind of draw a line under it is to design for change is crucial, recognizing that there are going to be multiple regulations that are coming. I also thought that Philip's point around, are you in a single jurisdiction, for example, in which case you may only need to worry about one subset of the standards, and therefore, taking that into consideration can help with managing scope as well.
Okay. And Paul, a question for you. Sorry, do you want to say something else, Philip? No. Okay. Coming back to you, Paul, a question, something you touched on earlier and very much along these lines as well, and I think the answer may be very similar. It asks, please would the panel provide some advice on how to build ESG data governance in the face of numerous and different emerging ESG regulations? I think it goes down again to decisions, flexibility, and looking forward.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess the key thing is, one of the kind of buzzwords that's come out in recent years is this concept of agile data governance. So having this concept whereby you have a set of, obviously you establish your structures in terms of the classic data governance structures, definitions and quality management and so on and so forth. But in terms of the scope that you go after, having a kind of a hopper of requirements that flow in, and then being able to prioritize those requirements and execute on them in a prioritized way is a useful structure to have, because what you can do is you can make sure that you don't commit to like a multi-year program where you may, as the changes come in, you've got serious change control problems. You've got kind of series of sprints that you run where you deliver to a set of requirements, which are all whilst building that kind of the sustainable capabilities you go. And any data governance frame is going to cover the same kind of things, but it's how you execute it that really makes the difference. And designing it in such a way that one of the feeds into your decision making is that view on what are the requirements, what are the priority data sets, what kind of insights do you want to develop as an organization? Because that's the other important thing. It's so easy to get fixated on the regulation and you need to report X, Y, Z, but what does it actually tell you? I mean, what does it mean in terms of what you're going to do differently as an organization? Because that might actually change what data you bring under governance first and that kind of thing. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, let's leave audience questions there. So thank you for asking them, and thank you to our speakers for answering them. And let me come back to you, Philip, to do a little bit deeper. And could you provide a step-by-step guide to building a data governance framework for ESG? What's needed? What kind of texts and tools?
So I think an inventory of what you've got available is a good place to start. I have built, I think, the foundations of at least the last 5 or 6 years of what I've been doing with Solidatus about reusing assets that you have in place. You don't, if you don't need to, want to reinvent a whole data collection ecosystem in your organization. The chances are, and I think Paul touched on this earlier, is that you already have a huge amount of data collected and available to you. Now, the next questions that come up are really interesting ones, like, can you use that data? So jurisdictional based stuff is where I spend quite a lot of my time. And, some jurisdictions let you share data and others don't, particularly when it's about people or, private data, that sort of stuff. So a good data sharing framework is essential around risk and compliance anyway. But if you haven't got one, this is your most personal set in some ways of data collection, particularly around the S, more than some of the other data sets. Establish ownership of the data. If you haven't done that, or if you're collecting new data sets, you need to understand who owns that data, but also who owns the problems. So typically this is a shared responsibility between a chairman and a CEO, but they'll delegate it as much as they can because they can't apart from being responsible for it, they can't be implementing it. So you need to understand the chain of responsibility. You will have regulations like senior managers regime in place, which describe a whole bunch of responsibilities through an organization. You need to tap into the stuff that you're doing already as much as possible. Right. So you've done all of that. Tooling's in place, your data governance tools in place, your metadata governance tools in place, your data sharing tools are in place. They're good to get at the beginning of the process. You have time to get this stuff done. That framework is done. Now you need to start hydrating data. So getting your supply chain, integrating it, getting the lineage, as Hani brought up earlier. I mean, obviously, as Solidatus, we're going to say lineage first. I mean, you've got to get that all in hand. And empowering people and letting people know that they are going to be scored on it. It's going to be part of their either OKRs or KPIs or whatever other mechanism you're using to measure people's performance. It's part of the company's being now. You're going to only be as good as the data you're putting in. You're only going to be rated by the data you pull out, and how I guess over time more frequently you can get it out, and how current it's going to be. So you want to make sure that all the tooling you're going to be putting in place is flexible. I think Paul's point about agile is really good. I still go down the DevOps line. You want to automate stuff as much as possible. You want to be able to make changes, almost put them in the morning, get them out in the afternoon. I've worked particularly in South America. They're used to making regulatory changes in the morning and expecting reports in the afternoon. I don't think this is going to be any different in some ways as things evolve going forward. So you want flexibility in your solutions. So summary is, look at what you've got, make sure you understand who owns it and how you can get hold of it legally. Make sure you establish lines of control for who's responsible for stuff. The governance tooling and the automation underneath the hood needs to be seamless, and that you understand who's responsible for reporting what and how frequently that needs to be reporting. That's my starter for 10.
Okay, that's great. That's very clear. Thank you. Paul, let me come to you, and let's move forward and see if you can tell us about a firm that has actually sort of done this stuff, not necessarily exactly how Philip describes, but a firm that has managed to build this kind of solution and what the outcomes have been.
Yeah, sure. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give kind of a blended case study, which is because there are various banks and financial services organizations and things that are obviously have been working actively on this for quite some time. And what I'm going to do is I'll kind of simplify it. So I'm going to talk about it as the bank, but it's kind of several banks have kind of taken this approach. And it's one way of doing it because other organizations have taken a very different approach. So you can almost take what I'm about to describe and then say, well, the opposite is some organizations have gone down. So in this case, we've got a banking organization. They have an existing enterprise risk management framework. So they've got a taxonomy that describes a set of principal risks, which things like credit risk and market risk and operational risk and so on, and key risks. They have a policy framework and a whole risk management industry that operates in that space. And the approach they decided to take was they were going to leverage the enterprise risk management framework to embed ESG into risk management. So what they did, they started by setting up an ESG framework, which talked about how it leveraged this framework. They made some adjustments to the principal risk framework. So they adjusted the taxonomy. So they had something around climate that they embedded in there. They leveraged some of the conduct risk, existing risk reporting structures, and had this framework describe how they were going to use the existing enterprise risk management framework to embed ESG. And then that meant that they could cascade a set of controls across the organization and have all the reporting and so on. And of course, it would all work magically. But of course, and what that also meant was that they could leverage BCBS 229. So as Hani mentioned earlier, so there's all of that rigor around risk reporting at the top of the house. So that is an approach or a variation on approach that several organizations have taken. However, so that's great, and it is a way of rapidly driving significant and very large scale change using the organization. But of course, you still have all the challenges that kind of approach has in the fragmentation of data, the various reporting systems. And whilst BCBS 229, it talks all about risk data aggregation and reporting at the kind of group or firm-wide level, actually having the kind of that integrated view and the flexibility to produce the kinds of reports and things that are needed is very challenging when you're not actually integrating all that data into one place. So whilst it's great in terms of being able to very rapidly roll out that kind of approach, there's still a whole load of technology work that's required to actually develop the reporting capability to satisfy all the various emerging requirements. So that's an approach again, and you can guess what some of the alternatives are in terms of doing it separately and those kinds of things. So that would be one example I'd share.
Okay, thank you. And Hani, we're running out of time, but a few quick questions from you, please, on what benefits, operational and business-wise, could you get out of this if you get it right?
Sure. Just then maybe add to the point Paul made there and Philip, just before that, very quickly. I think where I see organizations being really successful at organizing themselves is when they're point ahead of ESG. Just like chief data officers in the old days, I think that's the same thing. It just needs that focal point because of the fragmentation and the variety of this data set that comes from about 10, 20 different places in the organization. So kind of like getting somebody responsible, at least in the medium-sized organizations and larger, is fundamental, because otherwise you federate it out, and it's frankly, I don't think it's going to work. So I think hiring that centralized team, at least individual and a small team, is going to make a big difference. In terms of benefits, so I think first of all, I think it's really important from a risk reduction perspective, as if you call that a benefit, which is, you've got to get these numbers right. Your reputation is at stake. And then there is, of course, this whole piece around, staying at least on par with your competition, because if as a supplier of services, you're not seen to be sustainable, you'll drop off the radar very quick, right? You'll get asked those questions, and if you're not able to respond and evidence that you've got stuff on your website, that you're communicating, or you're working on it, you immediately drop off the radar. Yeah. And of course, you've got to stay in that race, and it's a good race to be in. Okay, we're going to do it for the right reasons. But there's all these benefits. The other benefit is many attracting talent as well. Is you think about that, that's quite important. Is many of the younger generation and older generation as well seek purpose, right? They seek more purpose, and it's quite a way of attracting talent as well into the organization, making people feel good about the place they work at, and what the organization does as well.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to have to wrap up now with some advice, perhaps from Paul and Philip. So, Paul, after our conversation, what advice would you give to our audience?
So I think just three things, headlines would be: design for change. So recognize that everything's changing and make sure that both your technology and process and governance and everything is designed to accommodate that. Leverage existing capability, because as has been mentioned, you'll already be reporting on a lot of this stuff in some shape or form. So don't forget that and make use of that. But also, just because of the scale of it, prioritize value, because you're not going to be able to fix this all in one go. That kind of agile approach is definitely the way to go in terms of going after things that are going to deliver the kind of the value that you want to be realizing first. Okay, from you, Philip.
We could have coordinated this a bit better, because two of those three are exactly what I was going to say. I'm going to add one to sort of bookend it, and I'm going to say, look, design for your data to be reusable as well. So you look at the existing stuff, you want to reuse it, and then just remember that the stuff that you're collecting will be needed again and again and again, and to try to foster that ecosystem that, to Hani's point, you can get an ESG data officer in place, but they're part of the data ecosystem. So whatever you're doing, make sure that you're making it, like an API onto data so that more people can benefit. And if you're cleaning up, several data sources and reusing a lot of data, then, help that data ecosystem to present stuff better for the next person coming along. But otherwise, Paul's points from mine. So.
Okay, thank you very much, and let's leave it there. So thank you all very much indeed for sharing your expertise and experience, and thank you to Solidators for sponsoring today's webinar. Just before we close up, a few 18 group items that may be of interest. You can sign up for our October the 4th RegTech Insight Summit here in London, download our 2022 ESG handbook, which we have recently republished, so that could be a great help to you. And you can take a look at 18 Connect, our professional platform that you can use to deliver highly effective and interactive events and webinars. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Philip, Paul and Hanny, and thank you to all of you who have taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback forms, as we're always keen to improve our products on the basis of your views. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.